There's never been a better time to start playing Pokemon cards. I mean, think about it. Regionals and internationals are awarding $20,000 to first place, and the World Championships, $50,000 plus one of the rarest Pokemon cards in the world. Yeah, I can't blame you for wanting to learn more. And I can teach you everything you need to know, all the way from the basics to the advanced strategies used by pros to help you win more than anybody else. Whether you've only ever collected and just decided to start playing, maybe you've watched a regional stream, downloaded PTCG Live only to get completely beaten, or you're already traveling to regionals and ICs but not getting the wins that you feel you should. Whichever the case, I've got the plan for you, because I was all those things myself once too. See, last year, I made it my goal to get to Worlds in Japan, but because I started playing so late, I only had about 6 months to do it, which meant I needed a strategy to get good, elite even, as quickly as possible. So I devised the plan, a formulaic approach to learn as much as possible as quickly as possible. And within a month, I saw results, finishing top 128 at OCIC. I won a League Cup in Italy of all places, until finally, I made it to Worlds, where after a grueling day 1, I fought into day 2 of the event, where only the best 150 players in the world compete, finishing in the top 64 to cap off the season. I've practiced with some of the best players in the world, former world champion Henry Brand, Brent Tonneson, Matthew Burris, James Cox, and along the way, I've competed against and beat world-class players too. Now, beating a pro doesn't make you a pro, but it does mean that my plan worked, and over time, I think you can become a pro too. So here are the strategies I've used to get this far, and what I've learned from all these great players along the way too. How do we create a strong foundation so that every game we play, we are gaining something, we are taking something away from it? Well, naturally, you need to start with the rules. How does the game work? What can and can't I do on certain turns? How do cards interact with each other? Then what I call the must-knows. Beyond the rules, the absolute non-negotiables of playing the Pokemon TCG. Something that every player needs to know before they go out into battle. As silly as it sounds, then we have the unknowns and how we as players can know what we don't know in the Pokemon TCG. And then finally, Ascension. How do we put everything that we've learned along the way together? You see, playing the Pokemon TCG, it's a little bit like writing down all your notes in a language that you don't understand. And only until you get to the end of your journey are you finally able to read and put everything that you've learned together. In this video, we're going to focus on parts 1, 2, and a little of 3. The fundamentals of the game, so you know how to play, understanding the current meta decks so you know what you'll be up against, and how to truly understand your deck synergy so you know how to drive the thing. And then as this series progresses, we'll jump into the more advanced topics. So let's start with the rules, which, yeah, seems like a pretty obvious starting point. To play any game, you need to understand the rules, but is especially important in the Pokemon TCG because the game has evolved so much in the last year or so that many decks and their strategies revolve around what you can and can't do at certain points of the game. So to start a game of Pokemon TCG, you got to flip a coin and decide who is going to go first. We usually do this with a dice these days. We call heads or tails. Depending on the deck you play will dictate whether you want to go first or second, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, if you haven't shuffled yet, make sure you've shuffled before you draw 7 cards. So both players draw 7 cards, and this is what we call your opening hand. To actually start a game, you have to have a basic Pokemon in your hand. So an evolution Pokemon isn't going to cut it here. It needs to say basic. You start that baby face down. And once both players have placed a basic Pokemon face down, they then lay out their 6 prize cards. Now don't look at these cards. You need to claim these cards to win the game. So put 6 prize cards face down on the side of your board. In order to win a game of Pokemon, you need to claim all 6 of these prize cards through the course of the match. And this is done by KOing your opponent's Pokemon. You can also win a game of Pokemon if your opponent has no more Pokemon left on the field. And alternatively, you can claim victory via deck out. That's where your opponent is unable to draw any cards, which is a pretty prominent strategy in stall and control decks, which that's the kind of deck you like to play. That's the kind of player you are. You know what? I respect it. Now, once you've fulfilled all of these requirements, the game can begin. On your first turn, going first. So if you're going first and it's your first turn of the game, you cannot play a supporter card and you are unable to attack. So you're able to do practically everything else that the game allows you to do, but you can't play a supporter card down and you cannot declare an attack. If you are going second and it's your first turn, things are a little bit different. You can play a supporter card down and you can also attack at the end of your turn, which is a big deal. A lot of decks in the Pokemon TCG revolve their strategy around this component of their game and often will elect to go second. So remember, if it's your first turn of the game and you are going second, supporters, they're okay. And attacking, you definitely want to do it if you can. Or not. The game's a little bit funny like that. As for the supporters, you can only play one per turn. So don't make the mistake that I did at a couple of regionals where I played 2 in the same turn and got a double prize penalty. That's no good. If you're going to play a supporter, remember that and make sure it's the exact supporter you want to be playing that turn, because you can only play one supporter per turn. You know what else you can only do once per turn? Attach an energy card from your hand to a Pokemon. And that's very, very specific wording for a very specific reason. You can only attach from your hand to a Pokemon once per turn, but some Pokemon abilities and supporters and even items let you accelerate energy around the board as part of their game plan. So beyond that one energy per turn from your hand, you can actually attach multiple energy to different Pokemon faster, depending on if you have an item card, an ability that lets you do it, or a supporter card that lets you do it. In Pokemon, we also have stadium cards, and you can only play one stadium per turn. You also can't play the same stadium that's already in play. So if your opponent has played down an Artisan, you can't play an Artisan down that turn. But if you have any other stadium in your hand, you're able to play it down. But remember, that's the only stadium that turn that you're allowed to play, so choose wisely. In Pokemon, we also have tools which you can attach to your Pokemon to give them extra functions or abilities, or maybe let them take a little bit more damage from certain attacks. However, a Pokemon can only ever have one tool on it at a time, unless it's something like Honchkrow V, which has an ability that lets you put multiple tools on it, but don't worry too much about that right now. The main thing you gotta remember is that one Pokemon can only ever have one tool on it at a time, unless noted otherwise. However, if you've got multiple tools in your hand on that turn and you want to attach them to different Pokemon, you're allowed to do that. You can attach multiple tools in your turn. You just can't put more than one tool on a Pokemon. I'm sure you're gathering a little bit of a trend here. In Pokemon, there's a lot of once per turn things you can and can't do. Another one of those is retreat. So if the Pokemon you've got in the active spot, you want to remove it and maybe promote something else that's ready to attack, or a Pokemon that you want to sacrifice as a KO on that turn, you can only retreat it by its retreat cost once per turn. However, if you've got an item like Switch or Escape Rope that will move your Pokemon from the active to the bench, provided you got that item in your hand, you can play it and move them around multiple times per turn. But that retreat is very specific. That can only happen once per turn. And it wouldn't be Pokemon unless we had evolution. However, Pokemon evolution has very, very specific rules. The first is that evolution is permitted once per turn per Pokemon. So if in the previous turn you played down 3 Rolts, on the next turn, provided you have got the Curlier in your hand, you're able to evolve each of them. However, you cannot evolve a Pokemon in the same turn that you play it down. So if you've got both the Rolts and the Curlier in your hand and you play the Rolts down onto your bench, that specific Rolts is not allowed to evolve into a Curlier. However, if there's a different Rolts next to it that's from the previous turn, that one's okay. And in the same way you can speed up leveling in the game, you can speed up evolution in the TCG too, provided that you've got the item in your hand, which is more often than not rare candy. You can skip a part of the evolution process. So a Rolts can skip Curlier and go straight to Gardevoir. You can go from a basic, skip stage 1 and go straight to stage 2. You've just got to play the rare candy, and the evolution Pokemon has got to be in your hand too. But don't forget that you can't do that in the same turn that you play down that basic. The basic has got to be in play from the turn prior. That's pretty important stuff to remember, because a lot of the decks right now focus on evolution, whether it's Gardevoir, Charizard, or Chien-Pao. You need to make sure you fully understand the rules of evolution and you don't violate them, because it can be costly. So there are a couple things that end your turn in the TCG. The first is when you pass. So you've got no more actions to make and you just hand it over to your opponent. You say, I pass. The other is when you declare an attack. Now this is really, really important, because the moment you declare an attack, your turn is over. If you've got any actions you want to make, anything else you wanted to do, you're unable to do that once you declare an attack. So make sure when you're fully done, that is the moment you declare an attack, because there's no takebacks IRL at a regional or an IC. It can get dicey, and I've seen too many players declare that attack before they were actually ready to, and it cost them games. So to quickly recap, make sure your deck of 60 cards is fully shuffled. Usually about 7 shuffles does the trick. Hand it over to your opponent to cut. If you're playing in real life, it's always recommended to cut your opponent's deck. Roll the dice to decide who goes first. Then each player draws 7 cards, and that's your opening hand. To start a game, both players need to have a basic Pokemon in the active. So if you've got one in your hand, place it face down. Next, you've got to place your prize card. So take 6 cards from the top of your deck. Do not look at these cards. but instead place them face down along the side of your board. As you take knockouts throughout the course of the game, you will be able to claim these prize cards and add them to your hand. With both players set up, you're ready to start the game, give your opponent a fist bump, and if you're going first, draw a card. At the start of your turn, you're meant to draw a card, and for some reason, I didn't show that here. So don't forget that one. Now, if during setup you don't have a basic Pokemon in your starting hand, this is what we call a mulligan. You've got to show your opponent your hand to prove that you've mulliganed, shuffle your deck again, and then draw another 7 cards until you get a basic. For every mulligan that occurs, your opponent is able to draw 1 extra card. It's up to them whether they want to do that or not. But when you do eventually get a basic, place it face down, then put your prize cards down. And if you're drawing that mulligan, make sure that you do that after you have placed your prize cards down. So as I was explaining a little earlier, one of the main ways to win a game of Pokemon is by taking all of your prize cards before your opponent. And you do this by KOing your opponent's Pokemon. Now, different Pokemon in the game have different prize values. VMAX Pokemon, for example, are worth 3 prizes. And that's because they're usually a bit bulkier, it's a bit harder to knock them out, and their attacks do a little bit more damage too. V-Star, and EX Pokemon are worth 2 prizes when you knock them out. And that's because they're a little bit bulky, but not as bulky as the VMAX. Their attacks do a little bit more damage, but not as much damage as the VMAX. So they're only worth 2 prizes. And then finally, you've got what we call single prize Pokemon. These look like the traditional Pokemon card. The illustration is a little bit smaller. You've got a yellow or a silver border. It's a basic, it's a stage 1 or it's a stage 2 Pokemon. It's a little bit squishier, so its HP is lower. The attacks don't do as much damage, so it's not worth as much when you knock it out. But in the Pokemon TCG, there's some really, really good single prize Pokemon that can do a lot of damage, and we're going to see them in a little bit. I don't want to jump too deep into pricing, prize mapping, when and when not to take KO, because there's a couple of things we need to learn prior. But for now, just be aware the different Pokemon are worth a different amount of prize cards. Knowing the rules is integral to being able to play the game, and once you know the rules, you're going to want to start playing the game. However, I feel like this is where most players get tripped up, because the game's pretty complex and there's a lot of different cards out there. There's a lot of Pokemon, there's a lot of items, trainers, supporters. It can be a little bit overwhelming, which is why before you jump online, before you put 60 cards together, I strongly recommend understanding the meta. Now, these are the strongest decks. These are the most established decks out there. And whether you're going to play a meta deck or not, it's very, very important to understand what decks you're potentially going to face and how they operate. Whether we like it or not, some decks are just better than others. And in the Pokemon TCG, the meta is a little bit like rock, paper, scissors. However, no deck outright beats everything in Pokemon, and occasionally, scissors can beat rock, as silly as that sounds. In the Pokemon TCG, we've got what are called archetypes. Now, archetypes, they're kind of like cores. Gardevoir EX is an archetype, but the cards that you put around it can vary. So there are multiple variants of Gardevoir EX decks out there, and you can put whatever card you want in your deck too, though I wouldn't really recommend it when you're starting out and just trying to understand, get a feel for the ropes, because it could be a bit confusing. But that's the beauty of the game. As you get better, you can start experimenting and find specific techs for different matchups and the different meta decks out there. You keep saying that word, J-Love, meta, meta, meta. When are you going to show me this fabled meta? Well, as it stands, this is the current Pokemon TCG meta. It's a bit of a hard and fast list because the meta, beautiful thing, is constantly evolving depending on player trends online or recent results at tournaments. Certain decks can fall in and out of favor very, very quickly. But if you're starting the game, these are the decks you're most likely going to see online. And if you're trying to pick it up, are the decks that I really recommend you start out with. And I think you're going to really quickly see why understanding the rules is integral to the deck you pick and its strategy. Take, for example, Gardevoir EX. This is an evolution-focused deck that utilizes Gardevoir EX's ability, Psychic Embrace, to move energy around the field really quickly and circumvent that 1 energy attach per turn from hand rule. So in Gardevoir EX decks, a lot of what you're doing is evolving your Ralts into Curlier so that you can use Curlier's ability, Refinement, discard a card and draw 2 cards in order to see more cards and do more things. And the cards you want to be discarding, it's those psychic energies, because Psychic Embrace shifts psychic energy from your discard to any psychic Pokemon on the field. Granted, you got to put a couple of damage counters on it, but that's integral to the deck's function and how it interacts with the Pokemon and attackers in it. So Gardevoir likes to focus on build-up play. It's okay with going behind a little bit because a lot of the cards in it have comeback potential and activate from when you are behind. And that evolution can be paced, so going from Ralts into Curlier into Gardevoir, or it can be accelerated, going straight from Ralts into Gardevoir EX to rapidly bring attackers onto the board in even your second turn. Or for the traditionalists out there, we've got Charizard EX, which is a hard-hitting tank, which is super effective into a bunch of different types like Gardevoir EX, that dark type, doing 2 times damage to Gardevoir EX decks. Now, Charizard EX likes to utilize that evolution mechanic as well, except it focuses on accelerating past more than that gradual build-up. So you're going to see a lot of rare candies in Charizard decks. You're going to want to go from Charmander straight to Charizard EX, and that's because when you evolve into Charizard EX, you're able to accelerate energy from your deck onto your Pokemon. So you're able to put 3 fire energy onto any of your Pokemon in any way you like. So again, this circumvents that attaching 1 energy from your hand per turn rule by rapidly bursting it onto the board. And Charizard, as it falls behind, does more damage. So even if it looks like the game is mostly over, if your opponent has taken a number of prize cards, Charizard EX's attack does more damage. Then there's decks like Miraidon EX, which you may have heard online are beginner-friendly decks, which is true. They are beginner-friendly decks, but that doesn't mean they are beginner decks or they're any worse than any other deck in the meta right now. A lot of Miraidon's strategy focuses on using a supporter as quickly as you can. And as we know, on your first turn going first, you can't play a supporter. However, on your first turn going second, you can. So you're going to see this deck elect to go second a lot. Another thing we can't do on our first turn going first is attack, but going second on our first turn, yeah, we're allowed to do that. So Miraidon EX decks focus on attacking on the first turn of the game, which can be devastating and oftentimes can end a game before it even starts. So if you like to go really fast, you like to take a stranglehold on the game before your opponent can even set up, Miraidon EX, potentially the deck for you. Then we've got Mew VMAX, which actually won the World Championships in 2023. This is a deck that just won't seem to go away. It's very consistent and it's very, very explosive. Its engine is very, very straightforward. It likes to put Genesect Vs down and use its ability Fusion Strike system to see more cards. So it focuses on drawing and seeing as many cards in the deck as quickly as it can. And it's also able to attack very, very quickly, with its main attack only requiring 1 energy attachment with that double turbo energy, which functions as 2 energies. So not only is it able to set up very quickly, it's able to attack in the very, very early stages of the game. And being a VMAX Pokemon makes it very difficult to knock out. However, on the other side of the coin, you've got decks that outright delete and one-hit KO Pokemon, like Giratina VSTAR. This is a deck that focuses on pace and flexibility. So your decisions throughout the course of the game will branch and vary and dictate what you can and can't do as the game draws to a close. Its greatest strength is the VSTAR ability of Giratina VSTAR, Star Requiem, which is an attack that outright deletes your opponent's Pokemon. So it one-hit KOs it. So big Pokemon like Charizard EX or Mew VMAX just get completely removed from the board. This deck has plenty of options and a bunch of different attackers in it too, which is why we say it's flexible. It's able to adjust its game plan depending on the course of the game, which is kind of similar to Lost Zone Box. This is my personal favorite deck and the deck that I played for the majority of 2023. This is kind of what we call a toolbox deck. So the archetype is Comfey, Greninja, Sableye, Cramorant, but the other Pokemon that you surround it, that's what makes the deck really spicy. It's got a strong element of surprise. So in the early stages of the game, your opponent's seeing the traditional Lost Zone Pokemon and isn't able really to decide or work out what they're playing against. But when those big Pokemon come out towards the end of the game and start doing some serious damage, that's when the fun really starts. I'd say Lost Zone Box is a hard deck to drive and almost impossible to master. It's a very, very difficult starting point, but I respect you if you're going to pick it up and learn to play the game in the way that I did, because it does force you to learn as much as you possibly can and get really good at decision making very early, which is really important in Pokemon. Then you've got decks like Urshifu Inteleon, which completely decimate decks like Lost Zone Box. And this is where that rock, paper, scissors element of the game comes into action. So Rapid Strike Urshifu Inteleon VMAX focus heavily on the abilities of Pokemon, like Inteleon VMAX, which is able to snipe and place damage around the board when you discard an energy, which is really frustrating if you've got a lot of small, basic Pokemon on your bench. And then it maximizes that damage placement with the use of a really fun card, Medicham V. Its attack, Yoga Loop, lets you take another turn if you take a KO with it. So you actually get to have 2 turns in a row before it's your opponent's turn. And what almost always follows after that is an attack with Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX, which hits 2 Pokemon at once. So this deck likes to snipe, place damage around the board, and then pick off and then finish the game by sweeping your bench, which is kind of annoying, but nowhere near as annoying as Snorlax Stall. Now, respect to you if you like playing stall control decks where you dictate what happens in the match. It's not for everybody, but it is an option in the Pokemon TCG. Snorlax's ability stops your opponent from retreating, so it likes to trap Pokemon in the active and give you no way of removing them and taking knockout. So it stalls you. It tries to force you to deck out or make misplays until eventually the Snorlax players win. It's what we call a control deck. You don't need to know everything about these decks in order to play the game, but at the very least, you should be aware of the general meta share. That way you kind of know what you're facing when you go to play. And of course, meta decks aren't the only decks out there. There are what we like to call rogue decks. These are decks that stray away from the traditional meta, from what everyone has established are the best decks, and they focus on that element of surprise. So if you can make yourself aware of rogue decks, you're going to reduce that likelihood of you being taken by surprise and losing purely because you just didn't know what was going on. Or maybe you want to play these decks instead of the meta decks because you reckon they're a bit more fun, and that's totally cool too. I respect it. But beyond just knowing the meta and the deck that you pick, you need to understand every card inside of that deck to maximize its potential. When you look at your deck, you got to ask yourself, what does this thing do and how does it do it? The Pokemon that are inside, what are their individual purposes? The supporter cards that you're playing, which ones and how many of them? The search cards that let you go and get Pokemon and bring them into play, how many of them? The switch outs in case you get stuck in the active, are you playing any? Seems overwhelming, but it's pretty straightforward. You just got to look at lists and dig into them a little bit. Take, for example, this Charizard EX list utilizing the Bibarel engine. Yes, I just said a lot of words which might not mean anything. And yes, there are a lot of cards on the screen right now, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What makes even less sense is this Charizard EX deck with a Pidgeot engine. And why is this Charizard EX deck different to this deck? It's what we're going to jump into. Easiest way to get to the bottom of that is to just lay the deck out in front of you and then analyze why each card is there and why you're playing certain counts or amounts of them. We're playing 4 Charmander because you can only play 4 of one Pokemon in your deck. So to maximize your chance of getting a Charizard EX into play, you play 4 Charmander. Heat Tackle for 1 fire energy and 30 damage is pretty decent at fixing math, and Blazing Destruction for 1 fire is good for getting rid of parts of the peak. We've got 1 Charmeleon in the deck because it's good to build up a Charizard EX over time between turns rather than relying on rare candy the entire game. We play 3 Charizard EX because this is our primary attacker, and while it would be nice to play 4, we can't fit everything we want into this deck, so 3 is the right number with certain other item cards in the deck. There's 2 Pidgey here because we want to build up to Pidgeot EX. It's a big part of our deck's engine. And we play this Pidgey in particular because the attack Call for Family is great for building up your bench on your first turn going second. There's 2 Pidgeot EX because the deck relies very heavily on the ability Quick Search, which lets you go and grab any card from your deck once during your turn. This is extremely powerful, and the way the deck functions relies very heavily on Quick Search. The deck's also got a couple of V Pokemon that don't really attack, rather they help set you up. So Rotom V's ability is really good for building your hand in the early turns of the game, and Luminiant and the ability Luminous Sight is great for finding a supporter in the turn that you need one. There's a few basic Pokemon in this deck that don't attack, but rather support the deck. So Mew and the ability Mysterious Tail is great for finding items in the early stages of the game, and it's also a bit of a sacrificial Pokemon, so you're okay with this getting knocked out in the first couple of turns. Manaphy is there to protect your bench with the ability Wave Veil, and Jirachi's here to protect you from Sableye in the Giratina and Lost Box matchup, and against Cresselia when you're facing off against Gardevoir. We've got a couple of tool cards in here, and we're going to see why very shortly. TM Devolution is great into evolution decks, which there are a lot of in the format. Vitality Band gives us an extra 10 damage, which is very helpful for math. And because we're playing Rotom V and Luminion V, Forest Sealstone is a great addition too. There's 4 Battle VIP Pass in the deck because we want to maximize our chance of setting up our bench on our first turn. And because this deck likes to find items early, this is a great addition too. Ultra Ball is a very important card for finding Charizard EX, Pidgeot EX at any point of the game, so it's very important that we have that in our hand, so we play 4. This deck relies very heavily on rare candy, and because we're skipping evolution for Charizard and Pidgeot, we're playing 4 of those too. We play a couple of Lost Vacuum because sometimes you've got to get rid of tools, and other times you've got to get rid of stadiums like parts of the peak. The deck also has a few one-off item cards, which are very precious resources. Super Rod helps us put energy and Pokemon back into the deck from our discard. Lever Ball is fantastic for finding those low HP Pokemon, and our deck has a lot of low HP Pokemon in it, so it's a great addition. And Switch is critical in case we get stuck in the active and can't move the Pokemon. There's 2 Counter Catcher in the deck, and that's because it's a very easy card to find because of Pidgeot and one of our supporters. And that supporter is Arvin, who basically makes the whole deck tick. Arvin lets you go and find an item card and a tool card from your deck, which is why we're playing multiple tool cards as well as all the items, because Arvin can go and find those for you at any point of the game. There's 3 boss's orders in the deck because targeting down specific Pokemon at different turns is pretty important to your game plan. There's 3 Iono, which are important for disrupting your opponent's hand in the later parts of games. And there's 1 Professor's Research, which is great for maximizing your chances of finding Rare Candy, Ultra Ball, Charizard EX in those critical turns of the game. And then we've got 3 Stadium cards, not only because their functions are very powerful, but also because we need to make sure we can bump Path to the Peak, which blocks the ability of Charizard and Pidgeot. Lost City, so that our opponent's Pokemon goes to the Lost Zone when it's knocked out, meaning they can't retrieve it with Super Rod. Collapse Stadium to remove liabilities from our board in the latter parts of games. And Artisan to assist with setup and building up Pidgey and Charmanders very early on. And then finally, 7 energy cards, because this is what we need to attack with that Charizard EX. You could potentially run this deck with 6 energy and 2 Super Rod, but we'll dive into those topics a little later on. So now, instead of just picking up a Charizard EX list and playing it because you were told it's the optimal version of the deck, now you understand what each card is doing and you got a feel for the synergy of the deck. Deck synergy is what makes decks tick, and the decks that maximize all 60 cards in the list function all together holistically. Those are the best kind of decks and the most fun decks to play. Now, you very well may know all of these things, but does knowing really make you ready? Does knowing mean you've solved whether you grab 2 Rolts off a VIP pass facing off against Miraidon in your first turn, or whether you grab a Rolts and a Radiant Greninja and then try and see more cards with concealed cards in the hopes of setting up that extra bit more? Does it help you work out whether you attach an energy to your Pokemon on your first turn, or whether you hold that energy in your hand and attach it on the next one? If we know the rules, does that mean we've solved whether to play Artisan to replenish our Rolts or to play the Collapse Stadium to avoid losing? These are what I like to call the 1%ers, and in the Pokemon TCG, there's probably a good 20 of them. So if you can get close to perfecting or mastering those 21%ers, you can improve your game by 20%. Over time, I'm going to help you solidify your game by knowing all the things that are within our control. For those of you that want to jump ahead, you can check out the full presentation stream in the link below. In the meantime, you can hit subscribe and join the TCG live streams to get a feel for my thought process. But for now, you should have a pretty solid understanding of the Pokemon TCG. How far you want to take it depends entirely on you. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.